everyone, I just wanted to say thanks to two of our fans. First is the Jason Love, who graciously sent us a sample of E.H. Taylor's Seasoned Wood. It's pretty good stuff, but don't go crazy trying to get a bottle on secondary markets. As we had mentioned back in episode 49, another E.H. Taylor release will hit the market at some point, so just hold out. A second goes out to Jamie Albritton, who created a Masters-themed meme that was posted to our Facebook page, and it says, "Mowing and listening to Bourbon Pursuit, a tradition unlike any other." Thank you to everyone that has supported us through Patreon. I hope everyone liked last week's Patreon-only content of being able to watch the entire Google Hangout session on YouTube. Just as a reminder, we will be having a giveaway every single month, so make sure you go to patreon.com, that's patreon.com/Bourbon Pursuit, and support the show. Without your support, we can't keep this going, so thank you all so much. Welcome back to the episode of the Bourbon Pursuit Podcast. My name is Kenny. And last night, Ryan and I had a chance. We went out to dinner, and we ended up at Haymarket Whiskey Bar, and we had a sample of something that we did in preparation for today's show because we had never had it before. And we'll talk about it a little bit later. But Ryan, how many times have you been to Haymarket now?
Gosh, I can't count how many times. It's at least 20 or so. But every time I go there, it's like they have so much that I don't have, and you're just lured into spending a lot more money than you want to because they have every bourbon imaginable that's not in your collection. So you can if you don't have it, you can go there and try anything.
Yeah, the menu is very intuitive. They even have a page called Discontinued Bourbons, right? They've got H&H 10-year. There were so many I couldn't even recall, but it's something that it's like, well, I wish I could have all these bourbons in my bar, but
they mostly sit there and evaporate probably.
Yeah, we had a good time talking with Matt Landon, who's the proprietor of it as well. So we get to hear some good stuff. But I think that's probably a good segue into introducing our guest today. So our guest today is Chef Edward Lee. Chef Edward Lee is a four-time James Beard Foundation Best Chef Southeast nominee. He's been on multiple TV shows. He's the culinary host of Season 3 of Mind as Chef on PBS. He was a contestant on the 9th season of Top Chef, and he's going to be a guest judge on Season 7 of Master Chef that will be premiering in June on Fox. So, Chef Lee, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I guess we'll kick this off a little bit. We usually ask guests how they got into bourbon, but this is very unique for us because having you on the show today wasn't something that we had actually thought of. It was our fans of the show. They said we'd love to have somebody who's a chef that does a lot of stuff with bourbon to kind of talk us through this.
And lucky you were it.
Yeah,
thank you.
and so kind of give us a little bit of a history about who you are and kind of what you do and what led you into Kentucky and Southern area kind of cuisine and all that sort of stuff.
Well, I'm a chef. Been a chef for a long time. I'm originally from New York, and let's see, I came to Louisville, Kentucky 13 years ago. Came for Derby, and I liked it so much, I drank too much bourbon and ended up staying. So now I got a wife and a kid and two restaurants, and things are going well.
So you're locked in here then?
I'm locked in for a while, yeah.
You said you came to the Derby and were drinking bourbon. Now, was that, it couldn't have been your first experience with bourbon, or was it?
No, bourbon, I've been drinking bourbon, since I was a kid. Probably more younger than I should have been. But it definitely was, I guess, when I came to Kentucky, I got my true taste of sort of craft bourbon or sipping bourbon, if you will. I think growing up, and I think most of the misconception of bourbon from, let's say, a decade plus ago, is you drank bourbon to get drunk, and you can still do that, but
it's still there.
You just shoot it down, fire it down.
But bourbon was cheap. It was something to mix with Coke, and I think when I moved to Louisville, I started to truly understand sort of the nuances and more upscale bourbons and sort of the art of sipping versus shooting bourbon.
So I guess in that regard, what intrigues you about bourbon?
Well, it's it's an American distilled spirit, which I think is interesting and important. Most of the spirits that we consume either come from a different place or have a tradition that is rooted in, let's say Europe mostly, or South America. And so for me, especially with the cuisine that we do, it's always nice. For example, when we opened our restaurant, we banned, and I don't say it in a bad way, but we decided to not use European cheeses, so that everything that we did came from an American sort of craft philosophy. So we were 13 years ago, we were one of the very early proponents of American craft cheesemakers, and 13 years ago, people didn't understand that there were Americans making really beautiful cheeses. Now you see it everywhere. So those are things that are very important to me as a chef and as a restaurateur. So obviously with bourbon, it was just a natural thing. And obviously being in Kentucky too, in the birthplace of bourbon, it was a natural for me to sort of gravitate to it.
Right. So I guess kind of talk about, what your, I'm pretty sure you've done plenty of dishes, integrating bourbon into them and stuff like that. Can you remember what the first one was? Like, was he making like sorghum with like bourbon cookies or anything like that?
Yeah. I think bourbon, I think the trajectory of bourbon is always to start out using it as a dessert because it's sort of natural. It's naturally sweet. It's got corn in it. So, the first things were dessert. I mean, whether it's a bread pudding with bourbon caramel sauce or putting bourbon into we made a bourbon ice cream, for example. So those are really just rudimentary things. Any kind of custard, sort of creme brulees with bourbon. Bourbon sort of adds a very nice whiskey flavor, but it adds a smokiness too. So, for example, when you make just a simple, reduced bourbon with some maple syrup and some sugar into it, you're getting sort of that whiskey, that sweet corn flavor, but you're also getting the taste of the barrel, which I think is very unique, and it adds a really nice flavor to things like bread puddings and desserts. And I think after you graduate, I think you mess around with a lot of dessert bourbon recipes at first, and then after you kind of exhaust through them, you realize that the bourbon actually has a really nice flavor that adds to a lot of other savory applications as well. And I think people don't automatically think of savory when they think about bourbon, but we've been making like bourbon vinaigrette for years, and it's a really nice touch. The more sort of we experiment with bourbon, the more we feel like we can push the boundaries of what flavor profiles bourbon can do to savory foods, not just sweets.
I think one thing we even forgot to mention, you had mentioned bourbon-flavored ice cream that you did in your restaurant. We forgot to even talk about your restaurant. So kind of tell people, the two restaurants you have here in Louisville and the kind of dishes that you serve and all that sort of stuff.
Well, we have 610 Magnolia, which is in Old Louisville, and it's our sort of flagship. It's our fine dining restaurant, and we do prefix menus. And I don't really describe the food. You just have to come and eat it.
There you go.
It changes nightly, right?
It changes all the time.
Yeah.
So it's just, I've stopped trying to figure out what it is. It's a good restaurant. And then
just come.
We have Milkwood, which is downtown inside Actors Theater on Main Street, and that's more of a casual sort of, and that's fun. It's more of a play on sort of Southern food with Asian notes to it. So we have everything from like ramen to pulled pork with grits, but we also do fun things like shumai. So it's a fun restaurant.
Does bourbon have any kind of inspiration on your menus from time to time, or is it just kind of you take into heart because you have a lot of things that are very like Korean inspired, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, the bourbon's always sort of there, and it just depends on what we're inspired by. We change the menu so much, but like right now at 610 we have a signature dessert called Bourbon Aficionado, and it's a fun dessert because we kind of took bourbon and sort of broke it down into its ingredients and flavor profiles. So the dessert is a combination of all the different flavors that I like in a bourbon. So, for example, there's like there's a base of it's sort of a drunken banana spice cake. There's butterscotch foam. There's a brown butter ice cream. There's freeze-dried corn. Yeah. And we drizzle it with maple sauce that's been aged in Pappy Van Winkle barrels, which is made by the Pappy and Company.
Mm-hmm. You can immediately charge whatever you want for that.
Yeah, it's a fun dish. And then we actually finish it by putting smoke in the glass, and then we sort of release the smoke at the table. So you get the whole idea of what, for me, is interpreted as what would bourbon taste like if you were to actually break all the components down and create a dish out of it. So it's a fun dish, and people love it.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to talk about the cookbook because my wife and a few friends of mine are big fans of it. We tried several. The relish we're big fans of. I can't think of the name, but I was trying to think on the way here. But these ground pork, like almost like flaky biscuits around.
Oh yeah.
What the name is it?
Yeah. It's the little pork pies.
Yeah, pork pies. Those things are killer.
Yeah,
we made those for a party once. Everybody was like dying to have more and more.
No, they're good.
Yeah, no, and the kimchi greens and stuff. And there's a lot of cocktails. Can you talk about some of your favorite cocktails in the book with bourbon?
Normally, I don't drink cocktails. Normally, I'll drink a bourbon with ice and maybe a little bit of soda in it. But I see the value of cocktails. And obviously, for a cookbook, you can't just say, here's bourbon in a glass with ice.
Yeah.
So
Cheers.
We had to come up with a few cocktails. And we serve bourbon cocktails at both our restaurants. The one thing about cocktails that I dislike is the overcomplication of it. Any cocktail that has more than like 4 or 5 ingredients, to me, it's just, they tend to be very confusing. And I'm sure there's a lot of cocktail people that disagree with me.
The mixologist.
Yeah, and listen, in good hands, I'm sure you can, just like a good chef can sort of juggle many ingredients, but it's hard. It's a very difficult thing to do, and I find that most of the time it's not done very well. We try and keep our bourbon cocktails very simple, so 3 ingredients, maybe 4 at most. And one of the things, I believe that bourbon is pretty, perfect in and of itself. So whenever you're mixing it with something, it's really only to enhance the flavor of the bourbon, if that makes sense. So it's not as though I find a lot of bourbon cocktails are, for example, bourbon and Coke, being a perfect example, something I drank all through college. It's the Coke doesn't do anything for the bourbon. In fact, if anything, the Coke masks the bourbon, and so you're not really tasting bourbon anymore. You're just tasting alcohol. So you're really just having a Coca-Cola with alcohol.
You're just ready to party, basically.
Yeah. So and I feel like in a different way, if you add too much, bourbon's already very sweet. So you're adding too much sweet, you're adding things that are also sweet. It just tends to mask the flavor of bourbon. So anyway, we try and keep our bourbon cocktails to be very simple, and just try and find contrasting notes to complement the bourbon, not trying to compete with the bourbon.
We jumped the gun a little bit. The cookbook is called Smoke and Pickles, right? So make sure that you can get it through any of the regular outlets, Amazon, all those different places. So anybody that wants to go out there and look for it, that's the easiest place to go get it. I guess another question, do you have a bourbon of choice when you're cooking? Or is it just kind of whatever is the closest thing you can reach within?
When I'm cooking?
Yeah, sure.
It depends on, and this is a topic that I talk a lot about. It depends on what you're cooking and what you want to do. And I worry less about the brand name and more about the age of the bourbon. So,
does the proof have any effect on it, or?
Yeah, it does have a lot of effect on it. So, and it's also the proof, and it's basically my rule of thumb is the sweeter the application, the younger the bourbon that you want, right? So if you're making like a bourbon caramel sauce, again, you're adding a lot of sugar to it. It doesn't really, you're gonna boil the hell out of it. So it doesn't really matter what kind of bourbon you use. A young 5-year bourbon is fine. You can get some stuff out of a handle, glass jar with a handle on it. It'll be fine. If you're making like a bourbon beurre blanc, where it's a very simple recipe, very few ingredients, and you're really tasting the bourbon. Then you want something that's much older, where the flavor of the bourbon is going to sort of be more aggressive and it's going to shine through the other ingredients. And you really want to use less of it. So you want to use a more expensive bourbon. With sweet applications, you tend to use a lot of bourbon and boil it down. Yeah, you don't want to use $100 bottle of bourbon and boil it down for that. You're not going to taste it, and it's not going to matter. Whereas if you're doing something that's a much more like a bourbon vinaigrette or something that is very bourbon forward, you want to use a nice bourbon. So, general rule: sweeter the application, the younger the bourbon. More savory, the older the bourbon. And again, I don't name brands because it doesn't matter what let's be honest. What does it matter if it's a 10-year-old bourbon? It's a 10-year-old bourbon. I mean, some are going to argue that this tastes like this, but it's a 10-year-old bourbon. There's going to be certain characteristics about that bourbon that are going to exhibit, regardless of where it was or is made and whatever the barrel mash was. It's 10 years old. You put anything in a bourbon in a barrel for 10 years, it's going to exhibit flavors of wood and char and smoke and all that. You know what I mean? So
absolutely.
I don't. To me, and again, I don't make, especially when you're drinking, it's different because you can really taste the nuances. But when you're cooking with it, I don't make any distinctions between brand. It's just about so young bourbon is just find a young bourbon.
Yeah. Okay. Totally.
Older bourbon, find an older bourbon.
You had an opportunity to partner with Trey Zoller back in, I think it was 2013 when it happened. It's still found on the shelves every once in a while, right? Can't really find it too much in Louisville because, well, Kentucky bourbon, it just doesn't exist. And but there's a great, it's called Jefferson's Chef Collaboration, and you see Trey's signature on there, but you also see with Chef Edward Lee. So kind of talk about the process of what it was to actually choose a bourbon that you're not cooking with, right? You're putting this out on the market as something that people are going to be sipping and drinking. Yeah.
So we did one bottling in 13 and we did another one in 15. So there is a new release out there, but it's very small. So it's still out there. If you can find some in the stores, you have a good chance.
You have a case at home, just hanging out.
I do. I have very little bit though.
Nice.
I don't get that much of it. But yeah, we I've known Trey for years, and we just decided we're drinking one night and eating, and it was an interesting thing because we were drinking bourbon and we had ordered food. And the friend that we were with then switched from bourbon to wine, which I think is this sort of a common thing that you see. And we just, the debate came up, like, why would you switch to wine now that you started your meal?
I'm at fault for that. I do it all the time.
Yeah, like why is bourbon simply an aperitif and not a something to pair with food? And the answer generally, we started asking people, and the answer generally is, well, bourbon is something you drink before a meal, and once you sit down to eat, like, why would you drink bourbon? You drink wine because wine naturally pairs with food better. And we started to sort of debate that and say, I disagree. I think you can drink bourbon through dinner, but you need a certain kind of bourbon. I think bourbons obviously are very aggressive, high in alcohol, very smoky, very, flavor is not exactly, ripe for a goat cheese salad. So we thought, well, what if we blended a bourbon that was specifically geared towards pairing with food, and would that work? So we started messing around. We started coming up with different concoctions, and we also started to for me anyway, I started to realize that food in this country used to be very Eurocentric, which is why we paired everything with wine, because most of the food that we ate when we went to restaurants came from a French or Italian tradition, which of course you're going to pair that with wine. But a lot of the cuisine now in America is very international, and it's paired with everything from, obviously American barbecue, which is, full of spice and smoke and sugar and really aggressive. You can't drink barbecue with wine. It just doesn't work. A lot of Asian-inspired food, which again is very spicy, very, very. There's a lot of sweetness in it. Soy sauce, a lot of fermented flavors, doesn't work with a lot of wine. And so when we started thinking about this sort of new generation of American cooks who frankly like to cook American food and who like to cook Asian food, and who may use some European traditions, but are steering away from it more and more. We thought, what better drink to pair with it than a smooth bourbon? And so that was our mentality, was to come out with a bourbon that was softer on the palate, a longer finish, smoother, rounder, just less aggressive, and allow it that you could actually drink it all through dinner and still have fun with it. And so that's really, so our bourbon, our blend was actually a pair. It's bourbon from 2 different years, and then a rye whiskey. So it's 75% bourbon, 25% rye.
Why did you throw the rye in there?
Well, when we blended the 2 vintages of bourbon together, kind of like in the way you would do with a cognac, it creates a longer finish and a much more complex sort of flavor profile. But we also noticed that it mellowed it out a lot. So, for example, I think on the first one we blended a 6-year and an 8-year bourbon. And an 8-year bourbon's got quite a bit of age, but blending it with the 6-year, it really sort of mellowed it. I don't want to say too much, but it really made it very soft, and the finish became longer. So we wanted something to kind of offset that, and to give it a bite. And so we had Trey had a really old rye whiskey that he had not, just waiting for something to do with it. So we thought, why not throw it in there? And we did. And it just kind of, gave it a little end note of spice.
Yeah.
And it just really kind of just finished it out for us. It was once we tried it with it, it was like, and then we had the debate of, well, it's not a true bourbon then, because we're adding the rye whiskey to it, so we can't even call it a bourbon. But once you tasted it with the rye, we're like, this is the right way to go. Like, even if it's not a true bourbon, we have to do it. Like, it was so delicious. It was so different from just the bourbon by itself. So we went with that recipe.
Yeah, that's why at the very beginning we want to put that teaser in there, because we went to Haymarket last night and we're like, okay, we're interviewing Edward Lee tomorrow. Like, let's try the chef's collaboration, and that's exactly what we got. So we had 2 pours of that last night.
I don't know if we had the 13 or the 15.
Well, the other thing was, we've had discussions before about, taste of bourbons will change over time depending on the fill level of the bottle and all this other kind of stuff. So, we might have tried something a little bit different than what other people were going to try with it. But I remember when we first had our first sip, I looked right over to you and I said, this tastes like creme brulee.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like almost spot on for us. It had a lot of those notes.
Yeah, kind of like the crispy crust on top of the creme brulee is what it kind of reminded me of.
Yeah, so that was just one of the very unique things that at least that I saw out of it that I don't know about you. But
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And then now that you talk about it, I do remember the kind of spicy, back end of it also. So it makes sense that you added the rye there.
Yeah. But it's just, for me, it's just enough rye to kind of pick it up. But it's not something that people really notice. They don't, like rye drinkers, for example, don't go crazy for it because it's not huge on the rye. But I don't know.
They're not getting the experiment look what they were looking for.
Yeah, and I think part of what the joy of eating food is that you get a lot of different notes and flavors and complexity out of eating a dish. And you should get the same amount of complexity out of a bourbon that you want to pair with that dish.
So what's some dishes that you would pair it with, for example? Just a couple.
Anything that comes off a grill. Anything. Okay. If you're gonna grill salmon, anything that's barbecued, pulled pork, smoked brisket, those things are perfect with it. Because any kind of food that sort of comes from a grill or smoke, to me, wine just kind of falls flat against it. Beer works, but I guess you're not always in the mood for beer. And if you're going to have a big meal, like how many
you
beers
don't be
you're
bloated,
drink.
before you.
And I think beer, and again, the beer snobs are going to kill me for it. But beer to me can be it's oversimplified, and I think it from a flavor, from a refreshing kind of mouthfeel palate, it's perfect. But from a flavor palate, it can sort of fall flat against it. To me, whiskey is the perfect sort of match to it. It stands up. It's not going to wither, away from it, but it also is not going to overpower it too. But I also find that, Asian food also works really well with whiskey. And the age-old adage was that these sort of European sommeliers, again, who are also going to get mad at me, there's always this age-old sort of pairing that when you pair Asian food with wine, you go straight to Riesling. And it's been drilled into everyone from the time that you go to wine class 101, and I just always say it's completely inaccurate. It completely, so coming from an Asian person who cooks and eats a lot of Asian food, is the last thing I want to have with Asian food is Riesling. It's fruity, it's sweet, and it just doesn't work.
It's interesting you talk about all that, because even in the grand landscape of whiskeys in general, there's so many that came out of Japan, and you got Hibikis and all these different things. And so it makes more sense that people might want to start venturing and saying we want to have more whiskey with our dinners and stuff like that.
If you go to Japan, you see people drinking whiskey with Japanese food all the time. Japanese whiskey is more Scotch-like, I think, than American whiskeys, but they drink whiskey all the time with dinner. You don't see them drinking. They'll drink whiskey or sake. They don't drink white wine with dinner with Japanese food. They just don't. But somehow in America, that's what we have to do. And
no Riesling.
No Riesling. I've always just found it totally inaccurate. And I said, listen, if you want to pair something with Asian food, a great whiskey, mix it with a little soda, maybe some bitters, it's perfect. It really, matches up to the sweetness. And it's not sweet on sweet, right? So Asian food tends to be very sweet, and the whiskey tends to be very bitter. And that sort of pairing is perfect. The last thing I want when I'm eating something sweet is to drink something sweet as well.
So we're running at the top of the hour here, and I got one last question for you, because we get to interview people, and a lot of people they look at them and they're like, these are superstars of the industry, right? And you're a master chef, you've got all these things, but how real are you? Can you just eat a regular ham sandwich, or do you have to you got to be like, I got to chef this thing up?
Yeah.
Got to be prosciutto with Gruyere.
No, I can eat a white trash sandwich any day. So what I say is, I either eat really lowbrow or I eat really highbrow. I kind of don't dabble in the middle.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So if I'm gonna go lowbrow, like I want the dirtiest fried chicken from the dirtiest gas station, or I want to go to like the
go to
nicest.
Indies chicken.
Yeah, Indies is like,
I love Indies.
Yeah, Indies is probably one of my favorite restaurants in the town in Louisville. No, I just what I don't like is stuff in the middle that kind of tries to be one thing but is not, but it's either really, really cheap or really expensive.
Let's go ahead and give you one more plug for your restaurant. If people if they're visiting the trail and they want to try your restaurant,
they better make reservations.
Exactly. How far in advance can you make reservations, and how do they do that?
610 Magnolia is, it's 2 weeks out. You're fine. Make a reservation. Milkwood it's a bigger restaurant, Milkwood, so just call us, or you can make a reservation online. And Milkwood's downtown, 610's in Old Louisville. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. It was a pleasure not only to talk to you. I know Ryan was really looking forward to this for a long time.
Very excited.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Can I get your autograph? No. Can you sign my knife?
Sure.
No, I appreciate you taking the time. I know you're a busy man, but it's cool to, because we drink bourbon, but we don't really always understand how it melds with cooking, and it's great to have you come on and explain it to us and our audience and whatnot. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on. Good luck, guys.
So if you like the show, make sure you subscribe to us on iTunes. You can follow us on Facebook, like us on Instagram and Twitter. Actually, you would follow us on Twitter, but make sure you do that. Also support us on Patreon, patreon.com/Bourbon Pursuit.
Yeah, and any show suggestions, feedback, comments, we love them, so keep them coming, and we'll see you next time.
This podcast of Bourbon Pursuit is in partnership with thewhiskeywash.com, a lifestyle website for news and reviews for people who like whiskey, and for those who think a life without whiskey has no style, thewhiskeywash.com.